Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 369 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. With autumn slipping away and winter on the horizon, my thoughts continue to be filled with helping our colonies survive to next spring. Feeding is complete, autumn treatments removed, but the challenge of the Varroa mite goes on. With that in mind, here's part 2 of Pests and Diseases. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. This week's podcast is brought to you, in part, by High 5 Multi-Guard. So,
when you need a little peace of mind that your bees are safe from dangers of all kind, pesticides, hornets, wasps and mice are no match for High 5. The High 5 Multi-Guard is the best one in town. Keeps your bees safe all year round. The ultimate solution has been found. It's High 5.
The High 5 Multi-Guard fits nearly all beehives and makes beekeeping much easier. High 5.
Hi everyone and welcome back to the podcast. Now this could be a very short podcast and I'm going to apologise up front for that. It's ironic that I'm talking about pests and diseases because last weekend we entertained our 2 young grandsons overnight from Sunday into Monday, and the eldest, who's just 4, had a very nasty cold. I won't go into the details, but his sleeves were well used. These little petri dishes of grandchildren filled full of disease have successfully passed on a cold bug to me, which I thought I'd managed to fight off all week. That was until this morning, when at 2 a.m. I woke and headed for the sofa. As you can probably tell by my voice, I'm hoping that I'm going to hold out, but we'll see. Anyway, the irony isn't lost on me, as I wanted to talk more about pests and diseases, particularly this week about the Varroa mite. Let's see how I hold up, and we can get both this bug and the Varroa mite under control. So, Varroa destructor, a seemingly insignificant little mite that gets into our hives and then runs riot, ending unchecked with the collapse of a colony. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of mite-resistant colonies and treatment-free Varroa mite control. I really just wanted to focus on the basics for any beginner beekeepers listening today to help give you an understanding of what you're up against and why it's important to maybe start off with a treatment regime and then further down the road, if you want to experiment with treatment-free processes, then at least you will have some background experience. So let's kick off with some basics and my take on controlling the mite population in the honeybee colony. I would suggest in recent times, most colonies have at some point had a population of Varroa mites. The trick here is management of the Varroa population rather than thinking eradication. This issue with thinking you've got rid of them all is probably complacency, and then they'll hit back harder than before, causing the potential collapse of your colony. If you'd like to take time to read up about the Varroa mite, there's a couple of really good online resources that I'd like to use. The first is our very own National Bee Unit. The website is called BeeBase. The second is an Australian website called Be Aware. I'll pop links into the podcast notes. The Be Aware website can be tricky to find because there are a couple of sites with the same name. So just use the link in the podcast notes. Anyway, let's assume you have a hive and you want to manage the Varroa mite. The first step is to learn about the mite itself. Once you gain a basic understanding of the Varroa mite reproductive cycle, it helps to create a pathway for managing them. First off, Varroa feed on both adult bees and larvae. They use their mouth parts to feed on the hemolymph by poking a hole into the body of the bee or larvae. This, of course, creates a wound and a route for viruses and other diseases to spread. Individual mites won't do a great deal of damage to a colony. It's the exponential growth of a Varroa population that eventually causes something of a collapse and the eventual death of the honeybee colony. As a beekeeper, you will definitely see signs well in advance of this end stage situation, so don't be too alarmed by what I've just said. Management of the Varroa population and being observant as you inspect are key to dealing with this challenge, and actually it's pretty straightforward if you stick to a few basic rules. So, if it isn't the smaller population of Varroa feeding on honeybees that causes a colony to die, what is it? Well, as I mentioned, the massive and sudden increase in Varroa mites as they breed, and increase is the ultimate reason. This exponential growth, as it is termed, sees Varroa mite numbers climb suddenly and rapidly once a lower threshold has been reached. Let me share an example that I've used before because I think it shows quite neatly how the population can rise rapidly. Think in terms of the growth of the mite population. I'll try not to get too sciencey and use as familiar language as I can. What I'm going to talk about is something called the reproductive rate, or R number, and I'll use the figure given by the Be Aware article of an average of 1.6 adult mites emerging, on average, from a worker brood cell. Remember, at the moment we're in late autumn and heading into winter, so we wouldn't expect any drone brood, although sometimes there is, of course, and the Varroa favours the drone brood. I'll let you have a think about why that would be the case. Here's a bit of Varroa biology to explain how their population grows if left unchecked. So the Varroa mites will enter a cell once the larvae is around 5 or 6 days old. Once inside the brood cell and it's capped, the mites are trapped until the adult bee emerges, which, as we all know for a worker, is 21 days from egg to emergence. Allowing for the fact that the mite didn't get into the cell until day 6, let's say, that leaves the mite trapped for a further couple of weeks, 15 days or so. Working on average mite numbers, our single mite population emerges as 1.6 mites plus the mother adult, giving us a population of 2.6 mites. 2 weeks later, they're at it again, and another round of egg-laying and mating occurs, and our population of mites grows. Each adult mite produces on average 1.6 mites. That's a population of 2.6 times 1.6, which gives us a new population of just over 4. Let's make an assumption that this happens into February. The next life cycle gives us 4 mites times 1.6, that's around 6.7, so that's 6.7 mites. So let's say 7 mites. It's now late February, and another mating sees the number grow, but not massively. 10 mites becomes 17 mites in March, which becomes 29 mites sometime around early April, 46 mites in late April or early May, 74 mites in June, 118 in late June or early July, 189 mites for the peak of the summer, until finally we get to just over 300 as we head into late summer and our Varroa treatments again. So if we get to just over 300, we're still in a reasonably strong position. But that's just 11 life cycles for our single Varroa mite in our fictitious colony. And please remember, I've simplified these numbers, but they do paint a fairly accurate picture. What if I don't treat with oxalic acid over winter, and I have, say, 6 or 7 Varroa mites in my colony as we go into the new year? Using the same number of an average 1.6 adult female mites emerging after mating, the numbers for our population grow as follows. And let's say we start with 7 mites, just to highlight the potential. Life cycle 1 equals 11.2 mites. Life cycle 2 is close to 18 mites. Cycle 3 becomes 28.7. Cycle 4 is around 46, 5, 73, life cycle 6 is 117, life cycle 7 is 188, life cycle 8 is 300. 9 is getting high at 480. Life cycle 10 produces a whopping 768 mites. And finally, 11 sees the mite population grow to 1,228. And this doesn't take into account that in drone cells, Varroa produce on average 2.6 adults instead of 1.6 adults. I won't go through all the numbers again, but if the mites use drone cells from April onwards, we would end up with a population in the first example of something like 3,500, and in the second example, a population of, incredibly, a massive 36,000 or more, and that surely spells disaster for any colony. Now, these figures are just examples, and I know that there are a lot of variables, things that can impact both the honeybee population and the mite population in a positive or negative way, but I do think it shows how quickly things can get out of control if Varroa mites are left unchecked, either by the honeybees themselves or by the beekeeper not taking any action. The National Bee Unit details a couple of thresholds that are important for beekeepers. First off, they recommend trying to maintain a Varroa population of below 1,000 mites. Now that sounds like an awful lot of mites if you ask me, but that's what they say. They also say that if the colony has a mite population that breaks through the threshold of 2,500, it puts the colony at risk of collapse. Folks, you should never be in a position where your colony hits these numbers. It will be very evident to any beekeeper who's inspecting regularly and pays attention to what's happening within the brood box if something is going wrong with Varroa. There will be plenty of signs. Learn to read the comb and the bees on each frame, and you'll soon pick up on when things are not healthy and further investigation is required. Just be aware that Varroa populations may seem small in the spring, but can quickly develop and get out of control in the height of the season, and it's most obviously apparent in some of our biggest colonies. There are other methods to positively affect the honeybee colony, whilst at the same time negatively impacting the mite population. These are more mechanical, physical methods, such as drone brood removal, or in fact a complete brood removal, something like a shook swarm. Drone brood removal simply involves removing drone brood in that first instance, relying on the fact that Varroa will preferentially choose drone cells to reproduce in, and we can use that to our advantage. The second option gives a total brood break, as you're removing all the brood from the colony, and with it any Varroa mites hidden in those cells. Don't forget there may well be phoretic mites. These are the mites clinging to the adult bees and not hidden in cells. So you probably won't remove all of the mite population, but you'll certainly reduce the numbers back down to a level that the colony and you will be able to cope with. Timing of any brood removal is really down to your plans as a beekeeper for the season ahead. Personally, I wouldn't carry out brood removal too early in the season, because that will likely inhibit the growth of the colony at a point where they really want plenty of new bees to help provide resources for the coming months and take care of the brood that's in that hive. Likewise, if you want a large summer foraging force, you may not want to remove brood in the weeks leading up to your major summer nectar flow. Perhaps immediately after the spring flow would be a good idea, allowing the colony to re-establish a large brood nest area prior to the June lull in forage, but before the main flow. Or how about immediately after the summer flow instead of using a chemical treatment? Sometimes you have no control over the when. If you see a colony struggling because of the Varroa population, you really have to do something, or waiting a couple of weeks could signal the death of that colony. Now is a really good time to swat up on your Varroa knowledge, particularly for anyone who is considering carrying out a winter oxalic acid treatment. Learn all about this pest now and work to reduce the numbers of mites in your colony throughout the season. I'll discuss Varroa again when we head towards our oxalic acid treatments, and that won't be long now. Well, if you'll all excuse me this week, I feel the need for my bed, and hopefully shaking off this blasted cold within the next day or two. I'll catch up with you all again next week. For all of you who haven't yet signed up to my Patreon page, I, together with Steph, have been creating beekeeping content for many years now. And if you're looking for some straightforward, down-to-earth tips and techniques, help and advice, then do take a look at my Patreon page. We have over 1,600 individual beekeeping posts, videos and podcasts filled with useful and timely help and advice. My approach is pragmatic and calm, sometimes entertaining, but always with help and support for beekeepers at the heart of what I do. I keep my videos short and concise wherever possible. No waffle, no flannel, just honest beekeeping advice from years of keeping bees. Take a look and join me for the new 2025 beekeeping season. It'll cost you less than a jar of honey. Head over to Google and search for Patreon and the Norfolk Honey Company.